Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Happy New Year, everybody. Let's make 2025 the best year yet. Today's topic to start off the new year is we're going to talk about voter registration numbers. Have you ever wondered just how many people in this country have identified as a Democrat or a Republican or an independent? Well, you might be surprised to find out that that is a straightforward answer. There's also no clear-cut definition of independent. Sometimes it means no party at all. Sometimes it means someone just outside of the Democratic and Republican parties, and therefore includes third parties. Sometimes it's specifically a party named the Independent Party of insert state name here. There's also the fact that not every state tracks whether a voter is a Democrat or a Republican. We'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Today, though, overall, we're going to talk about what we know about the prevalence of Democrats versus Republicans versus independents, how we estimate their numbers, how they are tracked, etc. And we'll talk about how these numbers have changed from 2020 to 2024 and how those numbers affected the 2024 election results. So let's dive in. So, first of all, how do we know voters' party affiliations? Well, we don't truly know the exact party affiliations of every single registered voter at a given moment in time in the entire country. There's a couple of reasons why we don't know that. Only 30 states actually track party affiliation data. The other 20 states just simply register the voter as registered voter, and that's it. They don't actually say whether they're Democrat, Republican, or any of that. Candidates running for office will declare whether they're Democrats or Republicans or third party, no party, whatever. But the voters themselves don't actually register as that. And also, whether the states actually track the party affiliation of voters or not, the state's election administrations don't necessarily post the data publicly on a frequent basis. A few put it up every day, but most others will only do it by week or by month or by a specific election date, maybe not necessarily even a specific interval of time, just depends on the state. And also counties who report their registered voter numbers to the states, they don't necessarily have to report the numbers to the state right away. They all have their different laws as to when they actually have to report those numbers. So you're not going to be able to just, at least for most states, you're not going to be able to just go, okay, what is the exact number of Democrats and Republicans and independents right now? Boom. Doesn't necessarily work that way. And oftentimes it does not work that way. So to get a sense of how many people are for every party affiliation, we use a combination of methods to get a sense of that. So the voter registration data that is available from states' departments of elections. We also have public opinion data, and there's a couple of particular organizations we take that data from. Obviously, a lot of this is how we get a sense of the overall country because we still have 20 states that don't track the party affiliation of their registered voters. And then we also sometimes use exit polls following elections. Those are the ones where people leave their polling place and then a pollster goes up to them and gets their demographic information and who they voted for and all that good stuff. Now, that only considers the voters who actually voted. It excludes the ones who sat out the election by default. So getting the entire you're not getting the entirety of the registered voter population because there are quite a few registered voters that don't turn up to vote. Just because they're registered doesn't mean that they're that intent on actually showing up to vote. So you're only getting part of that population there. But what are the different identifications in each state? Democrats and Republicans, pretty straightforward. They're found in every state, even when one is much weaker than the other. So There's still a Wyoming Democratic Party. There's still a Hawaii Republican Party. Third party existence, though, depends on the state. The Libertarian Party is the most common, but you also see a little bit more common ones, or ones that are also fairly common for a third party, but not as common as libertarians, are the Constitution Party, which is much more on the right, a little bit more similar to the Republican Party, and the Green Party, which is much more to the left, a little bit more similar to the Democratic Party, although more to their respective sides than the Republican and Democratic parties are. A lot of Green Party members think the Democratic Party isn't left enough. A lot of Constitution Party voters don't think the Republican Party is to the right enough. But whether these are considered quote unquote major parties in a state depends on those states' laws. They do not always have majority or major party status where they are ballot qualified. So, what makes a party ballot qualified? So a party has to reach a certain threshold of support where candidates can be listed on the party with said party affiliation. Otherwise, they'd have to be written in. They become a write-in candidate. So, like we said, Libertarian Party is the most common third party, but not every state has it where a candidate who is a Libertarian Party candidate can actually be listed on the ballot, their specific name, with the Libertarian Party label right next to them. In some cases, you just have to write them in the same case with Constitution and Green Party. So the requirements for qualification vary, such as the party can simply file a petition. They actually specifically get organized around a specific candidate. Candidate wins a certain percentage of the vote, otherwise they stay as a write-in, or the party needs a certain number of registered voters to say, we're going to be part of this party, and then they become that ballot qualified party. Otherwise, they're considered a minor party or a political group or whatever the state calls them if they are not a major party according to that state's laws. Now, in the case of voters who do not affiliate with any party whatsoever, they have different names depending on the state. Some states might call them unaffiliated, some might call them unenrolled, some might call them NPAs, which stands for non-party affiliate or no party affiliate, and might call them independent, which can get a little bit confusing because for some states there is an actual independent party, and when people try to register as an independent in those states, they see independent party and they think, oh, that's what I'm trying to be, when really they just mean they're just not going to be affiliated with any party at all. So sometimes a little bit of confusion there. There's also undeclared. In Alaska, they have a nonpartisan status. I believe they just call them nonpartisan. And then there's also an undeclared. So the difference between those two is that in Alaska, nonpartisan means you registered and you specifically said, I do not want to be a party. Undeclared means I'm registering to vote. I'm not saying anything about whether I'm affiliated with a party. I'm not even going to say that I'm not affiliated with a party. That's the basic gist of an undeclared in Alaska. So those are technically two different groups. Third parties versus voters with no party affiliation. We talked a little bit about it before. Sometimes those are both thrown in under the umbrella of independent, but third parties collectively make up a fairly small percentage of registered voters. Now, with the data I'm going to talk about later from 2020 and 2024, just for the sake of clarity and making the data less unwieldy, I'm just grouping third parties and voters with no party affiliation together, but obviously I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to it. But first, let's get to public polling data. So, like we said before, public polling data is a gauge of party affiliation of voters on a national scale, since not every state tracks the party affiliation of their voters. And the organizations measuring, these aren't necessarily the only ones that actually do it, but they're the two biggest ones that do it. We have Gallup and we have Pew Research Center. So Gallup is they've been around for a very long time. One of the earliest polling firms to have been founded. And usually Gallup's polls are about 1.5 to 2.5 week intervals, at least in recent times. And so when they question people about whether they consider themselves Democrats or Republicans or independents, independents have been a plurality for years now. 2012 was the last time that they weren't in the Gallup poll. And whether there were more Democrats than Republicans or vice versa, that's been pretty back and forth over the last few years or so. The true percentage of Democrats versus Republicans versus independents isn't fluctuating all that much, but the poll is just trying to get a sense of how many of each affiliation there are. There isn't truly, for the fluctuations that are there, there aren't really truly that many people that are changing what their party affiliation is. It's just, again, this is a sample of a population. It's trying to get a gauge of the population, but we can't fully see what every single person believes. So it's an estimation. So if it says something like 28% say they're Republican and 27% say they're Democrat and whatever number, 40, whatever. It's not necessarily that there are absolutely 28% Republicans and 27% Democrats. It's just based on the sample. That's the base. That's a general area, and people can say that they're independents. A lot of people will say they're independents because they think it's a more socially desirable response. So there's a phenomenon in polling called social desirability bias, where even though your information is not going to be provided publicly, you still get a little bit of a, ooh, I don't want this pollster to think weirdly of me. So they might say that they're independent instead of Republican or Democrat because they feel like that might be a bit taboo, for lack of a better term. So they say, oh, yeah, I'm an independent. And there are a lot of independents or some independents that say that they're, much more in the middle of the road, but in reality, they think a lot more like a Democrat or a Republican, sometimes looking more Republican than some Republicans or looking more Democrat than some Democrats. So now for Pew Research Center, they also have done party affiliation surveys like Gallup, although they're less frequent than Gallup is. And also, Pew Research Center likes to see which side that these independents lean. They call them leaners. So say, okay, if you're an independent, which side do you typically support? So then they kind of group Democrats and Democratic leaners, and then Republicans and Republican leaners. And like we said before, Pew Research Center, in their data, they've found a lot of times that Democratic leaners look a lot more Democrat than they might want to admit, and Republican leaders look a lot more Republican than they might care to admit too. In an April 2024 report, they said that Democrats and Democratic leaners and Republican leaners were about neck and neck. 49% were Democrats or leaning towards Democrats, and 48% were Republicans or leaning toward Republicans. Now, contrast that with a survey from 4 years before that Pew did, and the Democratic side was up 51% and the Republican side was up 46%. So there was a very noticeable closing of that gap, and the data from states that do track party affiliation also attests to that closing of the gap. But before we get to those, we're going to talk about the states that don't track party affiliation data. So these are mostly concentrated in the very north central, inner central part of the eastern half of the US. So I'm not going to list every single one of the states. I don't think you necessarily want to hear the exact list. And actually, Ballotpedia has this list, so you can look for it yourself. But for some examples, you have Alabama, Hawaii, Illinois, Minnesota, Montana, Ohio, Texas, Virginia. So it's obviously hard to estimate the number of people in these states that are Democrat or Republican or independent, and especially those who are third party or independent, because, like we said, Some independents look more like Republicans or Democrats, even though they identify as an independent. But based on voting history, we can sort of estimate at least the number of Democrats and Republicans, or at least compare how many Democrats there are to Republicans. So, ones where you're definitely going to find a lot more Democrats than Republicans are states like Hawaii and Illinois. And the way we do this is simply based on the voting history. Hawaii is maybe the most Democratic state there is. Illinois is also very Democratic. Not that they don't vote Republicans in, they have Republicans in their state legislatures. And not too long ago, they had a Republican governor. But by and large, they vote Democratic. So Hawaii and Illinois are definitely Democratic leaning electorates. How many of those are independents? Hard to say, but at least compared to Republicans, Democrats are going would be more numerous if that state tracked voter party affiliation. And then on the flip side, ones that are definitely many more Republicans than there are Democrats are ones like Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, North Dakota. Again, based on their voting history, you simply look at those states and they routinely vote Republican for their statewide races, and most of their other elections, at least at the state and federal level, are won by Republicans. Ones that are probably more mixed, but still slightly favoring one side or the other. Michigan might be maybe a little bit more Democratic just because they have been voting more Democrats in statewide lately. Minnesota probably would be a little bit more Democratic leaning, but since Republicans can be pretty competitive in those states at a more frequent level, uh, you would say that those ones are still a little bit more mixed. But again, not sure exactly how much independents play a role in those elections. That's when you'd start to rely a little bit more on those exit polls. But again, got to remember that exit polls only account for the voters who actually show up to vote, not just any registered voter. And of course, regular public opinion data by the likes of Pew and Gallup and other organizations like that. Now, for the states that do track party affiliation data, and these are mostly concentrated in the West and Southwest and in the Northeast. And there's 30 states. And again, not going to list every single one of them, but ones like Arizona, California, Delaware, Florida, New Jersey, New Mexico, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Wyoming. Data cited here comes from voter registration statistics on these states' respective departments of elections websites in the 2020 and 2024 elections. I try to get as close as possible to the voter registration totals near the elections, though, again, as I stated before, partially depends on the availability of the data and how often they track that data. Sometimes it's just by month, sometimes by week, sometimes only by the time of that election. And also, you got to account for the fact that there's not many states that have what's called same day registration, where you can register to vote and vote on the same day. Usually, you have to be registered to vote some number of days beforehand. It might be like 10 or 21. Florida has to be, you have to be registered to vote 29 days before the election. And also, not only just register to vote in the election, but you have to be, like, if it's a closed primary state, for example, you have to be registered with that party specifically by that time. So it's not like in Florida, my state, if you wanted to vote in the Republican Party primary and you are registered to vote, but you're registered as an independent, you can't vote in that party primary. But you also can't just within that 29-day period, you also can't just switch to the Republican Party to vote in it. You have to be in that. You have to be a Republican Party voter 29 days before the election, and same thing with the Democratic Party in Florida. Both parties use a closed primary system in the state of Florida. And so it'll be a similar thing to other states that have that same kind of closed primary system where you have to be registered to vote a certain number of days before that deadline. So only 13 of the 30 states that track voters' party affiliation allow same day registration voting. And in the case of North Carolina, they only allow it for early voting. So can't be 100% sure of the exact numbers due to when information was posted, but these are fairly close to this 4-year period where the numbers I have here are pretty close to who was registered to vote for the 2020 election and could vote in the 2020 election, and then who was registered to vote for the 2024 election, and if they were allowed to vote in the 2024 election. And the dates of the reports are also not necessarily the exact numbers at the time of the report. Sometimes a state will run the report several days after they get those numbers. And for this data, I've also combined the third party voters with non party voters, like I said earlier, just to make the data less unwieldy. And there's a relatively small percentage of voters registered with a third party. So, just to make things a little bit easier. Now, how have voter party identifications changed from 2020 to 2024? How much have Democrats and Republicans and independents lost? How many voters have each of those groups lost or gained? So we'll look at both the individual years and then how much actually changed over that 4-year span. So, results of the 2020 analysis: plurality or majority by group. So, how many states had a plurality or a majority that were registered as Democrats? How many of them had a plurality or majority of Republicans? And how many had a plurality or majority of the other group? Again, third parties and no party at all. So 2020, again, this is just considering the states that track voter party affiliation. So it's just these 30 states. 14 of the states were a plurality or majority for Democrats. 9 states were a plurality or majority for Republicans. And then 7 states were a plurality or majority for others. So Democrats had the lead in that regard. And the 5 states with the highest percentage of Democrats in their electorate were Maryland, New York, Delaware, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania in that order. And Maryland and New York had a majority of their electorate registered with the Democratic Party. 5 states with the highest percentage of Republicans in their electorate: Wyoming, followed by Idaho, then Oklahoma, then Utah, then South Dakota. And in the case of Wyoming, Idaho, and Oklahoma, those were majority Republican. And then the 5 states with the highest percentage of others in their electorate was Alaska, then Massachusetts, then Colorado, Connecticut, Rhode Island. Alaska and Massachusetts were a majority. And then we go to the 2024 analysis: plurality, majority by group. You'll notice a considerable shift in this regard. Now it's only 7 states that have a Democratic plurality or majority. 11 states where that goes to Republicans, that plurality or majority. And then 12 states had a plurality or majority of others. So Republicans and that others group made very big gains. 5 states with the highest percentage of Democrats in their electorate for 2024: Maryland, then New York, then California, then Delaware, then Pennsylvania. Maryland kept a majority. You'll notice that New York, still a very Democratic state, but it is no longer a majority for them in, uh, or a majority Democrats for New York, but I'll get to that in a second. 5 states with the highest percentage of Republicans in their electorate: Wyoming, Idaho, Oklahoma, South Dakota, then Utah. Wyoming, Idaho, Oklahoma, and South Dakota had a majority or have a majority of Republicans in their electorate. And then 5 states with the highest percentage of others in their electorate: Massachusetts, Alaska, Colorado, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Massachusetts, Alaska, and Colorado have a majority of their voters identifying with that others group. So Comparing 2020 to 2024, again, noticeable loss of ground that Democrats had in voter registration. Talk about plurality and majority changes. Democrats lost a plurality or majority, or they lost their plurality slash majority status in 7 states. Republicans gained 2 states where they became the plurality or majority. And then others gained 5 states where they became plurality. Sessions of plurality to majority. Democrats ceded the plurality to the others group in 4 states: Nevada, New Jersey, North Carolina, Rhode Island. Republicans ceded their plurality status to others in 1 state, Iowa. So, well, Iowa is still pretty even between the 3 groups, but now that others group is the plurality in Iowa. So Republicans did cede a plurality status to the others group, but Democrats also ceded their plurality to Republicans in 3 states: Florida, Kentucky, and West Virginia. And it is, and in the case of Florida, and well, actually all 3 of them, it was it is a considerable difference was from 2020 to 2024. In every state, the proportion of the total electorate that was Democrats decreased. So every state, so of the total electorate, the percentage that Democrats made up in every state went down from 2020 to 2024. And the top 5 states where they lost a percentage of the total electorate was West Virginia, Nevada, Rhode Island, Wyoming, and Oklahoma. In 21 states, the proportion of the total electorate that was Republicans increased. So Republicans had big gains in a lot of places. Top 5 states where they gained a percentage of the total electorate was Wyoming, Idaho, West Virginia, New Hampshire, and Florida. In fact, with Florida, since it's my state, I'm a lot more. I can notice it a lot more on the ground. In 2021, Republicans had surpassed Democrats in total registered voters for the first time, and that back in 2021. Now they have over 1 million more voters than Democrats do. It's a considerable shift, and it was still pretty close even in 2022, but sometime between 2022 and 2024, Republicans made enormous gains on Democrats in the state of Florida. And obviously, Florida is a very big state, but still, even for a state like Florida, 1 million voters is a lot of people. And then in 25 states, the proportion of the total electorate that was others also increased. So the others group actually made more gains than even Republicans did. And that attests to the fact that more and more people, generally speaking, have been identifying as independent in the United States. In the top 5 states where the others group gained a percentage of the total electorate was Nevada, Colorado, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Delaware. Now, moving from percentages to sheer number of voters, talking about straight up totals for the groups, registered Democratic totals decreased from 2020 to 2024 in 25 states. And that total for the 30 states decreased by about 2.8 million voters. So not only have Republicans and others gained ground on Democrats, Democrats have actually been losing total voters in general. Republican totals increased from 2020 to 2024 in 23 states. And the total for the 30 states, the total number of Republicans in these 30 states has increased by about 1.8 million voters. And then, especially for the others group, the totals have really shot up. Others totals increased from 2020 to 2024 in 27 states. And the total for the 30 states increased by about 3.5 million voters. So, examples of states that the only ones where Democrats actually gained more voters between 20 and 2024, had more voters for the 2024 election compared to 2020, California, Delaware, Kansas, New Jersey, and Utah. Meanwhile, for Republicans, the states where they actually lost total voters in were Alaska, which is a little surprising because Alaska politics are very quirky, but it still typically votes Republican, although the state legislature is actually pretty balanced between the two parties and even includes some independents in the state house. But the number of total Republicans decreased in Alaska, Colorado, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Oregon, and Rhode Island. And then the only states where the others group lost their total number of voters from 2020 to 2024 was Idaho, New Hampshire, and Wyoming. There's an interesting New Hampshire is a little odd in that they both in terms of total number of voters, Democrats went down, Republicans went down, and others went down. So total number of voters for New Hampshire actually decreased between 2020 and 2024. So just to give you a sense of where we see the total number of voters really make big gains. So comparing the percentages of the total electorate that were Democrat and Republican and independents, and then or others, and then the just straight up totals there, just to give you a sense of all that. And so this gain in Republican voters and loss in Democratic voters played a really big factor in Trump's victory in 2024. Party identification is the biggest factor as to, or not, or let me rephrase that. It's the single most predictive indicator of who somebody's going to vote for. Most Republicans that turn out to vote, they're going to vote Republican. Most Democrats that turn out to vote, they're going to vote Democrat, regardless of who the candidate is. And so, with this major gain by Republicans in total registered voters, and if these 20 other states that don't track voter party affiliation, if they did track the party of the voters, you'd probably see a lot of them show similar results. But for the presidential election, 4 of the presidential battleground states that track voters' party affiliation were Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. And all of those saw not only a big gain in total registered voters for Republicans and others, Democrats saw a big loss in registered voters. So less total voters for Democrats and losing a percentage of the total electorate that was Democrat. So obviously not the only reason. I mean, elections are never only one reason why they happened the way they did, even though sometimes when people talk about them, they like to boil them down to one, maybe two things. But the change in total registered voters was a huge factor in why Donald Trump was able to win in 2024 after losing in 2020. So there's the basic sense of how many Democrats, Republicans, and others, independents, third parties, there are. So that is going to do it for today's episode. As always, thank you so much for listening. Let's end off on a random question. So it is a new year, so it only makes sense to ask, what is at least one of your New Year's resolutions? And I actually have to more officially formulate some of the resolutions I have. I have been towards the end of last year, I was a little more lax on lifting weights. I still play basketball quite a bit, but I need to be a lot more. And part of it has been time, but also part of it has been you just wanted to play basketball instead of lift. So I'm gonna redouble my efforts there on the upper body, the core, and the lower body. I don't skip leg day. A lot of people actually, I guess I can't really say that, but I do not avoid leg day like the plague, like a lot of people do. But uh, need to do the whole body. So that's again, I'm still formulating the exact resolutions. I don't try to. I'm not too big on resolutions just because I feel like it's shouldn't really be tying them to a calendar. The shouldn't be tying specific things you want to do to a change in a calendar, but it works out for some people though. So I've rambled on enough. So thank you so much for listening as always. Uh, Social media and such in the show notes for this episode. My book, which touches a little bit on this topic actually, why independents rarely win elections and how they could become more competitive, available on Amazon in ebook and paperback format. My Facebook page, my LinkedIn, Matchmaker FM profile if you want to be a guest on this podcast, or if you want me as a guest on your podcast, I'd love to come on. Uh, but that's going to do it for today's episode. So, as always, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, take care.